All right, so here I'm going to record what we talked about in class a little bit. Remember, what is muscle? Why are we going to study it? Just a basic review, and then we're going to really get into the architecture and nitty-gritty of all these things. But remember, muscle is this excitable tissue that is able to convert our chemical energy, ATP, into mechanical energy. And that's going to be really important when we talk about the cross-bridge cycling and actin and myosin interactions and everything that we do. But why should we study muscle? It's really important. So just as the review, remember there are 3 different types of muscle. Let's just go over them really quick. First, our skeletal muscle. Let's put SK for skeletal muscle. And then we had our cardiac muscle. And then we had our smooth muscle. We'll just put SM. And just some of the properties or characteristics about this. Remember, skeletal muscle, that's going to be involved in locomotion, right? Our movement and everything. But it's how does it move in the first place? Well, it's neurogenic is what we call, right? Neurogenic, meaning that it's innervated. So I have to tell my brain has to tell my muscles to move, and that's gonna make them move. So that's the neurogenic, innervated. There's a lot of skeletal muscles in the body. I mean, there's like 650 muscles. And if you think about that, your muscle itself is an organ. So there's like 650 different organs. Well, not different because it's still the same muscle tissue, right? But it's pretty interesting to think how many muscles there are in your whole body, right? And this is voluntary. Now, cardiac is not neurogenic. There's another term for that. Remember, it's called myogenic. And that means that it's able to contract all by itself. It has those pacemaker cells are able to cause a depolarization and induce the action potentials and so on, and get the contractile cells to contract. So that's myogenic. However, it can, of course, be influenced by our nervous system, right? Because it is innervated by our parasympathetic and our sympathetic innervation. So if you have like sympathetic activation, then you have the epinephrine binding onto like your beta-1 adrenergic receptors, and that's going to increase your heart rate. That's ionotropic, and then you have a chronotropic effect, a stronger heart rate, and so on. So it's important to remember that just because cardiac cells are myogenic, there's also influenced by your parasympathetic, your acetylcholine releasing onto the muscarinic receptors, and so on. Cardiac muscle, really though, when you say that, we're only talking about your heart. So why should we study muscle anyways, right? As we already talked about, it's important for our locomotion, right? Movement. It's important for our posture, right? Just me standing here, for example, or you sitting in the chair. All those muscles are very important, and we need to understand how they work. But there's another important part which is involved in its, health and disease. This is actually a really big one when we really understand it, is how important muscle is when it comes to health, disease, and then of course aging, right? These are actually disease and aging are quite a bit related. But why does it help with health? It helps because first off, muscle tissue is what's considered a myokine. It's a myokine endocrine signaling tissue, and so it can secrete myokines. Some of these ones would involve something like irisin, for example. This is a really important molecule. Lots of potential benefits with it when it's secreted out into the blood. Another one is our cytokines, interleukin-6. This is typically pro-inflammatory, but when your muscles secreted after acute exercise, this actually has hormetic-like effects and ends up activating like interleukin-4, interleukin-10, has anti-inflammatory effects. So these myokine signaling effects of the muscle is really important. Another interesting one is we can call, it secretes what's called metabokines. Probably the best example of this would be lactate. Now, a lot of people hear about lactate to lactic acid as it's a misnomer. You actually don't produce lactic acid in the body, it's lactate, and people think that this lactate causes fatigue and makes your muscles sore and everything, and it doesn't. If anything, it has the opposite effect, so we'll talk about in bioenergetics in the future module. But lactate is really, really important because it's a great energy source for the brain, for example, and other tissues like the heart. But one of the things it can do is lactate can actually increase this molecule called BDNF. And what is that? That's brain-derived neurotropic factor. And BDNF is important for like neurogenesis and like improvement of the brain's overall health. And that could be one of the links of why exercise has so many benefits for the cognitive function, the executive function, for the brain health in general, right? Is potentially because lactates activating BDNF. Now, there's a lot of other pathways as well, but that's a big one. Another big one to consider is when we eat food, we need to do something with all those carbohydrates that we just ingested. If you think about how important it is to regulate glucose levels in the blood, it's essential. You have about 5 liters of blood in your body. And if you have a concentration of glucose of, say, 100 milligrams per deciliter, which is quite a bit elevated actually, but we're just using this for easy numbers, that means that you have around 5 grams of sugar in your blood, of this glucose, like a teaspoon of glucose. That's not a lot. And yet, if you go less than that, right, so like half a teaspoon, so you're only at 50 grams, I mean now, or 2.5 grams, I mean now, you're going to be in a coma, for example. Your brain can't function. If you double that, put another teaspoon of sugar in your blood, now you have full-on diabetes. You're getting the glycosylations and all the other problems that happen with diabetes. So it's very problematic, and we have to regulate that. Well, when we eat this food, what happens? Well, we'll talk about this later, but just to give an idea, muscles store a lot of this glucose as glycogen. And so you could consider your muscles act as what we could refer to as a primary postprandial glucose sink. And I'll just write this: primary postprandial glucose sink. Kind of made this acronym up. It's really important because otherwise, if you don't have very much muscle, then what has to happen? Your liver has to metabolize the glucose, break it down to pyruvate, and then it goes to basically make citrate, and then you make fatty acids out of that, and it stores it as fat, and so on. It's just this whole process, and it's not as good as simply being able to take the glucose molecules and store it into your muscles as glycogen. So you want to have high levels of muscle mass, just because that alone can be helpful to help attenuate or prevent things like diabetes, type 2 diabetes, for example. So that's a big one. Other things that muscles are really important in doing is all the signaling that can happen, right? So we can just write, we can write over here. Okay, I'll just put signaling. And this is really referring to intracellular signaling. And what we're talking about are things like our AMPK, PGC1 alpha signaling, right? This is important for like mitochondrial biogenesis. We'll talk about more of these pathways and how exercise activates these pathways and then increases mitochondria density. Other ones like our NRF2 pathway, important for our detoxification, antioxidation systems. You have, of course, mTOR is another big one for median hypertrophy. There's so many of them that happen in the muscles, the intracellular signaling, and we'll go through those more. But this is why it's so important to understand muscles in general, is just some of these things. But then, of course, there's other areas. If you think about like athletic performance, you want to understand, how do you get stronger? How do you get more force development? How do you have the velocity, force-velocity relationships? What other things can you do to have higher neural drive and so on? And then, of course, there's the psychological factors with muscles as well. I mean, just like your physical appearance, right? How do you look? How do you feel about yourself? That's going to be important for just your overall body composition, your quality of life, your ability to prevent injuries from happening, right? All of those are really important. And then, of course, again, just your overall well-being and psychology and the sociology of all of that. So muscle, again, very important organ, often underrated, not really understood to be an organ in and of itself that influences the rest of the body systemically. And so that's why we're going to really get into the nitty-gritty of the architecture, and then into the physiology of what's actually going on, and then finally into the signaling pathways. So let's get ready for that.